You know that feeling when your entire world stops spinning? When something shifts and you can never quite go back to how things were before. That's what happened to me on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was getting the car detailed, nothing fancy, just a spring cleaning because I like to keep things nice. And when the guy was vacuuming the interior, he found it. A tube of personal lubricant wedged underneath the passenger seat, still almost completely full. And before you think, well, maybe it was just for her and her husband, let me stop you right there. I knew exactly what it meant. I'd been sensing something was off for months. The late meetings at work that never came with emails or project updates, the way his phone would buzz, and he'd turn it face down so quickly his hands moved faster than I'd ever seen them move. The showers he'd take when he got home, even though he'd supposedly been in an office all day. Little things that individually could mean nothing, but together they meant everything. His name was Callum. We'd been married for 8 years at that point. We met in university, one of those cliched stories where you're both reaching for the same textbook in the library and your hands touch, and there's this spark. Or at least, I thought there was a spark. I thought we had something real. We bought a house together in 2015, a lovely 3-bedroom Victorian terrace that needed work but had good bones. We'd painted the kitchen together, laughing while we argued about whether the blue was too dark. We'd hosted dinner parties and taken vacations, and made plans for children we thought would come eventually. We'd built what felt like a life, and somewhere along the way, apparently, he'd decided that building a life with me wasn't quite enough. I stood there in the car detailer's garage with that tube in my hand, and I felt my chest go tight. The thing about discovering infidelity isn't that it happens all at once. It's not like someone punches you and you feel the impact immediately. It's more like you suddenly see all the photographs from the past year in a different light. Every time he said he had to work late, there's a different image in your mind now. Every time he brought home flowers and you thought it was sweet, you wonder if it was guilt. Every memory gets recontextualized, rewritten, made smaller and meaner. I paid for the detail and drove home slowly. I sat in the car in our driveway for maybe 20 minutes, just holding that stupid tube in my hands, looking at our house. At the window boxes I'd planted with petunias just the week before. At the weathered welcome mat that said, "Home Sweet Home," in faded letters. At the life I'd built with someone who was clearly living a different life somewhere else. That's when the idea came to me. And I'm not going to lie and tell you it was noble. It wasn't. It was pure, crystalline rage. Pure hurt crystallized into something dark and solid and certain. I went inside. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, and I started thinking about what I had in the house. Industrial supplies. Callum had converted the 3rd bedroom into a bit of a workshop years ago. He did odd jobs for people, made extra money fixing furniture and renovating spaces for friends. He had glue, proper adhesive, the kind that could bond metal and wood and, well, skin. I know what you're thinking. I know how this sounds. I was angry, and I was hurt, and I made a decision that I'm not entirely proud of. But I was also tired. Tired of wondering, tired of making excuses, tired of pretending that everything was fine when clearly everything was catastrophically, devastatingly not fine. So I made a choice. I went to the workshop and I found the industrial strength adhesive. It was in a grey container with a red warning label, the kind of stuff you have to sign for when you buy it because it's serious equipment. I also found a pair of latex gloves and a small screwdriver. Back in the kitchen, I carefully emptied the lubricant into a glass jar. And yes, I was still wearing the gloves because some part of my brain was telling me that this was a line and I was about to cross it, and I wanted to maintain at least some distance from what I was doing. I poured the thick, colourless adhesive into the empty tube with meticulous care. I sealed it. I cleaned up every trace of what I'd done, and then I put it back exactly where I'd found it, in that hidden spot underneath the passenger seat, making sure it was wedged in at exactly the same angle. The whole operation took maybe 15 minutes. 15 minutes to potentially destroy my marriage and someone else's life. Funny how little time it takes to cross certain lines. I spent the rest of that afternoon cleaning the house. I changed the sheets. I did laundry. I made a grocery list and went to the store. I did all these normal, everyday things while feeling completely untethered from reality, like I was watching myself from outside my body. The wine wore off, and I didn't pour another glass, even though I wanted to. I needed to be clear-headed for what came next. When Callum came home that evening, he kissed me on the cheek, a peck, nothing more, and asked what I'd made for dinner. Chicken parmesan, his favourite. We ate, and we made small talk about his day, which he described in vague terms that told me absolutely nothing and somehow confirmed everything. After dinner, I told him I needed to go out of town for the weekend. Family stuff, I said. My sister was going through something and had asked if I could come stay with her for a few days. It was an excuse I'd prepared carefully. Callum seemed almost relieved. He had plans with friends, he said. Maybe he could finally use some of that relaxation product he'd bought. You know, for stress relief. The normalness of the conversation almost made me laugh. I left the next morning. I packed a bag, gave him a kiss at the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might actually see it, and I drove to my sister's house. She didn't know what I'd done. I didn't tell her that day, or the next day either. I just sat in her spare room, and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. It was Saturday afternoon when I got the call. An unknown number. My stomach dropped immediately because I somehow knew. A woman's voice, confused and slightly panicked, asking if I was the wife of Callum something. Yes, I said, my mouth very dry. There's been an incident, she said. An incident. What a word. An incident. Like he'd spilled coffee or missed a meeting, not, your husband and I are currently stuck together by industrial adhesive, and it's the most humiliating moment of my life. Apparently, Callum had been visiting someone, a woman named Natasha who lived in a flat across town. I hadn't known that name until that moment, and hearing it felt like a small additional betrayal. He had a specific person, not just a random transgression, but someone specific enough that he'd thought to visit her apartment. They'd used the lubricant, exactly as I'd anticipated they would, and very quickly realised something was catastrophically wrong. They were, in Natasha's clinical and horrified description, quite stuck together. She'd called an ambulance. The paramedics had arrived at her flat and taken one look at the situation and decided they needed backup. That's when the fire department was called. Apparently, it's not uncommon enough that they have a specific protocol for it, but they do have experience with adhesive-related incidents. That's the thing nobody tells you about firefighters. They don't just put out fires. They deal with industrial accidents. They help people who've superglued their fingers together, or, in this extraordinary case, superglued their entire bodies together while committing infidelity. I hung up the phone. I sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. And then I did something I didn't expect to do. I laughed. Not a pleased laugh, not a satisfied laugh, but a slightly unhinged laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest and wouldn't quite stop. My sister knocked on the door, asking if I was okay, and I had to tell her everything. She did not laugh. She called me a genius. Then she called me insane. Then she asked if I wanted her to drive me to where the ambulances were heading, because apparently they were on the street now, and it was becoming a neighborhood situation. I didn't go. Not right away. I sat with what I'd done, and I tried to feel something other than this strange, hollow vindication. The truth is that revenge, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel as good as you think it will in those moments of planning. It feels complicated. It feels heavy. It feels like you've won something but broken something else in the process, and you're not entirely sure if the trade-off was worth it. I eventually drove back home that evening. I needed to see. I needed to know what the actual consequences of my actions were, beyond just the phone calls and the ambulances. The street was mostly quiet by then, but you could see the remnants of emergency vehicles, tire marks, a few hazard cones that hadn't been picked up yet. A small crowd of neighbours had gathered to speculate. I parked in the driveway and pretended not to listen to their theories. Apparently there were firefighters involved. Apparently it was quite dramatic. The next morning, Callum's phone blew up with messages. I'm not proud of the fact that I looked at his phone, but at that point the marriage was already destroyed, and I was beyond pretending that I had any moral high ground. Messages from his solicitor. Messages from Natasha, who was apparently equally furious with him for dragging her into this disaster. Messages from his mother, who had apparently heard some version of the story and was confused and horrified in roughly equal measure. He came home Sunday evening. I heard the car pull up, and my entire body went rigid. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. He came in and he looked destroyed. Not physically. The paramedics and firefighters had eventually managed to separate them without major lasting damage, though apparently it had taken acetone and patience and a fair bit of careful manoeuvring. But emotionally, he looked hollowed out. His eyes were red. He'd clearly slept badly, if at all. He saw me, and I saw him see me. And in that moment, I think we both knew that we both knew. The certainty of it hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Did you, he started. I didn't let him finish. Did I what? Put industrial adhesive in a tube of lube you were keeping under the passenger seat? Yes. Yes, I did. Did I do it because I found it on Tuesday? Yes. Did I do it because I've known for months that you were cheating? Yes to that too. He sat down very slowly in one of the kitchen chairs. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. And then he said the single most pointless thing anyone has ever said in a moment of crisis. I can explain. No. No, he couldn't. There is no explanation for infidelity that makes it better. There's no context that makes it hurt less. There's no justification that takes away the fact that he'd made a choice, over and over again, to betray me. And I'd made a choice in response, and now we were both living with those choices. We didn't really talk that evening. We just existed in the same space, breathing the same air but worlds apart. He slept in the guest room. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered when exactly I'd become the kind of person who would pour industrial adhesive into a container and slip it under someone's car seat. I wondered if that was the real me, or if I'd become that person in response to what he'd done. I wondered if there was even a meaningful difference. The next morning, he met with his solicitor. By that afternoon, I had my own solicitor. We were dividing our life into his and mine. The house would be sold. The furniture would be split. The picture frames that held our memories would be separated, and those memories would be carved up between us, each of us keeping the versions that hurt less. He moved out by the end of the week. He went to stay with a mate in Birmingham while we sorted the logistics of dissolving what we'd built. Natasha apparently decided she wanted nothing to do with him, which I found grimly satisfying. She'd wanted to pursue some kind of legal action against him initially, claiming he'd damaged her reputation, but ultimately decided it wasn't worth the publicity. The gossip around the neighbourhood was absolutely extraordinary. Everyone had a version of the story. Everyone had seen something, or heard something, or knew someone who had been on the street that afternoon. I became the wife who'd trapped her cheating husband, which was both exactly what I'd done and also a significant oversimplification. The internet somehow got a hold of it. Someone must have recorded the ambulance or the firefighters, or maybe just taken photos. And for about a week, I couldn't scroll through any social media without seeing some version of our disaster repurposed as content. People were divided on me. Some thought I was a hero, a woman who'd finally stood up for herself. Some thought I was dangerous and unstable. Some thought the whole thing was karma, that Callum had gotten what he deserved. Some thought I should be prosecuted for what I'd done, that gluing someone to another person without their consent was assault or battery, or some combination of things that lawyers would argue about. I didn't read most of the comments. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath of something like this. The divorce proceedings were relatively quick. Callum didn't contest much. I think he understood that he'd forfeited the right to negotiate aggressively when he'd decided to betray me. We split the assets 50-50, which was the law anyway. I got to stay in the house for 6 months before it would be sold, which gave me time to find somewhere else to live. He agreed to pay maintenance, which felt like the bare minimum of responsibility, but at least it was something. My therapist, I started seeing one about a month into all of this, kept asking me if I regretted what I'd done. It's a complicated question. I regret the hurt it caused Natasha, who was essentially an innocent bystander in a situation I'd orchestrated. I regret that it happened in such a public way, that my marriage's dissolution became neighbourhood gossip and, briefly, internet content. I regret that I became the kind of person who could be so calculated and cruel, even in response to cruelty. But do I regret that I did something instead of just sitting with the knowledge and pretending? Do I regret not giving him the opportunity to continue living a lie while I deteriorated slowly in the background? No, I don't regret that. I regret my methods, maybe. I regret the specific implementation. But I don't regret refusing to be invisible in my own life. In the months after everything happened, I learned some things about myself. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought, but not in the way I'd hoped. I'd hoped to be strong in the ways that come from good judgment and emotional intelligence. Instead, I learned I was strong in the way that comes from desperation and anger. Those aren't the same thing, and one is considerably less admirable than the other. I also learned that revenge is like a drug. It works for about 20 minutes, and then the crash is devastating. In those first few days after the incident, when I was watching Callum deal with the consequences of my actions, I felt powerful. I felt vindicated. But that feeling faded quickly, and what was left was just sadness. Sadness that my marriage had come to this. Sadness that I'd become someone capable of this. Sadness for Natasha, who'd gotten caught up in my rage. Sadness for Callum, who was now living in a one-bedroom flat in Birmingham, dealing with the very public humiliation of having been sexually compromised and then adhesively compromised in a way that made headlines. The house sold in September. I bought a smaller place, a little cottage on the outskirts of town with a garden that needed work. I threw myself into renovating it. I painted walls and refinished floors and planted things and watched them grow. It was a better use of my energy than planning revenge had been, though infinitely less dramatic. I bumped into Callum once, about 8 months after everything. We were both at the same coffee shop, a stupid coincidence that made us both freeze, and we had a conversation that was awkward and stilted and far too polite. He asked how I was doing. I asked how he was doing. We made small talk about the weather. I didn't ask about Natasha, and he didn't mention her. Eventually we left, and that was that. I haven't seen him since. His solicitor sends me information about the final settlement of various shared accounts. I saw on Facebook, months later, that he'd started dating someone new. A woman named Rebecca, who worked in marketing and had 3 dogs and seemed, from her public profile, to be the exact opposite of me in every way. I unfollowed him after that. What I want to tell you, and I'm saying this not as the woman who poured adhesive into a tube, but as the woman who's had time to think about what that means, is that infidelity doesn't justify revenge, but it doesn't not justify it either. It exists in this complicated space where normal morality seems to break down. You can be wronged and respond with something that's also wrong, and both things can be true simultaneously. If you ever find yourself in a situation like the one I was in, discovering that the person you trusted most in the world was betraying you, I would tell you this. Don't do what I did, not because it won't feel good in the moment, but because it won't feel good for long, and the feeling after that won't be good at all. Talk to someone. Get support. Make decisions from a place of clarity rather than from a place of pain. You can leave someone. You can end a relationship. You can walk away. Those are all valid responses to infidelity. But supergluing someone to another person, well, that's a response I wouldn't recommend, no matter how satisfying it might seem in the planning stages. I rebuilt my life. It took longer than I expected. There were days when I woke up and, for about 30 seconds, I forgot that my marriage had ended, and then I remembered, and it felt like finding out all over again. But there were also days where I woke up and felt something like relief. Relief that I wasn't spending my energy wondering anymore. Relief that I wasn't living in a house with someone who'd chosen to live in 2 lives at once. Relief that I could finally just be myself without constantly comparing myself to whoever Natasha was or whatever he'd found in her that he hadn't found in me. The weird thing is that people still recognize me sometimes. Someone will realize who I am, and their eyes will widen, and they'll say something like, "Wait, are you the superglue wife?" And I have to nod and smile and pretend that being infamous is something I'm at peace with. I'm mostly at peace with it. I've accepted that this is probably how people will know me, at least for a while. I'm the woman who got caught cheating on, and then got revenge in a way that made it onto the internet. It's not the legacy I would have chosen for myself, but it's the one I've got. The one thing I've realized is that this whole situation, the discovery, the revenge, the fallout, was educational in a way that normal life rarely is. It taught me about myself. It taught me about what I'm capable of when pushed to the edge. It taught me that the things we do in our darkest moments are often permanent in ways we don't anticipate. And it taught me that healing is possible, even after something like this. It just takes time and intention, and a willingness to forgive yourself for being human and flawed and angry all at once. So here I am now, almost 2 years later. I've got a new house that's starting to feel like a home. I've got a therapist I actually trust. I've got friends who know the whole story and still love me. I've got a job that matters to me and goals that have nothing to do with revenge or pain or trying to prove something to someone who doesn't deserve my energy anymore. And on the difficult days, when I think about what I did, I don't feel ashamed exactly. I feel something more like regret mixed with a small amount of satisfaction. I hurt someone to send a message to someone else, and while that makes me someone capable of cruelty, it also makes me someone who refused to be invisible. I'm trying to make peace with both of those things being true. The thing about your life unraveling is that it unravels all at once. But rebuilding happens so slowly you don't notice it's happening. One day you realize that you can think about your ex without feeling that tight pain in your chest. One day you realize you're happy about something that has nothing to do with him or this situation. One day you realize that you've become a different person than the one who stood in a garage with a tube of lubricant in her hands, trying to decide if she was going to burn her life down. I did burn my life down. I just did it in a very literal, adhesive-based way. And somehow, I've managed to build something new out of the ashes. Something smaller, maybe, something quieter, but something that's actually mine, built on a foundation of honesty with myself, if nothing else. That's the real ending to this story, not the firefighters pulling him off her, not the humiliation, not the divorce. The ending is me, in a cottage with a garden, making tea, and knowing that I'm going to be okay. The ending is the quiet afternoon when I realize that I don't think about him anymore. Not because I'm pretending, but because he actually stopped taking up space in my head. The ending is accepting that I made a choice that I'm not entirely proud of, but I made it as a human being in pain, and that's something I can live with. So the next time you find yourself in the position where you're thinking about doing something that feels like revenge, something that feels justified and necessary and right, take a breath. Step back. Give yourself a little distance from the moment. Because I can tell you from experience that the moment where you pour the adhesive is only about 5 minutes of your life. But the months and years that come after it will be defined by that 5-minute decision. Make it count. Make it something you can genuinely live with, not just something that feels good for a few minutes and then leaves you with a debt you'll be paying for a very long time. I'm glad I survived it. I'm glad I came out the other side. And I'm glad that my story, for all its messiness and pain, might help someone else avoid making the same choice I did, or if they do make it, at least understanding what they're signing up for.